In August of 2018, I saw this big discussion on Twitter that really pushed me towards making a video about it. It was the idea of the 2019 NHL Entry Draft, and whether or not Vancouver Canucks fans would trade Thatcher Demko and the Canucks first-round pick in exchange for the first overall pick. Now, this was back in 2018. We didn't know it was the Devils that would eventually win it, but if we redo that scenario today and we take a look at it, the hypothetical trade proposal would have been the Vancouver Canucks Thatcher Demko and Vasili Podkolzin in exchange for Jack Hughes. Now, back in 2018, when I saw this initially and it was taking its rounds on Twitter, I made a video about it that was treated to some pretty interesting discussion in the comments section below. We had half the Vancouver Canucks fans in the comments saying, yes, I would trade Demko in the first for Jack Hughes because we have DiPietro. And we had the other half saying, no, I wouldn't do it because our top 10 pick is still going to be a top 10 pick. We're still going to have a good player, and trading away a Demko to upgrade our draft pick to a Jack Hughes isn't worth it. However, we're almost 2 years past that point, and we have a few other external factors that are different from when this video was made initially. And I think it's these external factors that can really change the dynamic of how we take a look at this trade proposal and this question today compared to 2 years ago. The factors that I have in mind boil down to three really interesting things. First off, it's Elias Pettersson, the guy who is currently the Vancouver Canucks top-line center and who looks to be that for the next generation of Canucks hockey. Second off, it's Michael DiPietro, the guy who many would say is the Vancouver Canucks' best goaltending prospect today. And third, it's Jacob Markstrom, the guy who most people would say is the best Vancouver Canucks goaltender that we've seen in a while. The reason these three assets and these three pieces changed the discussion so heavily is because back when we talked about this Hughes for Demko and the first thing in 2018, we didn't have the success that these three assets have today. Back in 2018, Elias Pettersson hadn't made the NHL yet, and some people were debating on whether or not he would need to start in Utica. Sure, some people thought that he would be super good right off the bat, and I was one of those people, definitely. I said that in the video 2 years ago. But not everybody did. There was a certain insecurity that came with Pettersson's game, saying things like, okay, the guy's light, okay, the guy's never played on North American ice, okay, the guy's fresh out of Europe. There's no guarantee that he is going to be so good, which is why the argument for a first-line center player like Jack Hughes down the line does exist. Secondly, Michael DiPietro is a guy whose first season in the AHL with the Comets had a better save percentage than Thatcher Demko's first AHL season with the Comets. Now, DiPietro's team was really good in front of him, and that's certainly something that I have to hold against him in this context. But at the same time, Michael DiPietro is progressing in a way that a lot of Canucks fans were somewhat insecure about when they drafted him 3 years ago. DiPietro, as an OHL guy who was short, wasn't really supposed to be a goaltender who had a chance of becoming an NHL caliber player. But his progression in the AHL so far suggests otherwise, and he already had one better season than Thatcher Demko. Furthermore, Jacob Markstrom, back in 2018 at the beginning of the year before the season started, was still a very normal goalie, as perceived by the fans. It wasn't until 2018's Christmas and the rest of 2019 where we really started to see Jacob Markstrom become a Vezina caliber-like goaltender. So that changes up the dynamic of this conversation that we have here, because back in August 2018, the main arguments for this Demko for Jack Hughes thing were, okay, if you want Jack Hughes, then you're filling out your first-line center spot for the next few years. That changes because Pettersson is now Pettersson. On the flip side, the main argument to keep Thatcher Demko in the first was that Demko is going to be the guy down the line. He is going to be the number one, he is going to be the starter, and there is nothing Canucks fans or Canucks media can do to change that idea. Well, it's 2 years later, and all of a sudden the Vancouver Canucks have a legitimate number one goalie in Jacob Markstrom that they need to re-sign. And they have a DiPietro in the system who is looking much better today than he did 2 years ago. It begs the question on if Thatcher Demko has gotten to a point where he is expendable. And with this whole idea of Seattle coming into the picture, with the uncertainties of Jacob Markstrom's future and Thatcher Demko and whether or not one of these goalies would be taken, it's something that you have to think about. So if we go back to that original trade idea back from 2018, which was Demko and the Canucks 2019 first for the first overall pick in general, you have Demko and you have Podkolzin, and you're swapping that for Jack Hughes. The ultimate question here is, would you do it? And it really boils down to the same idea that we had 2 years ago. Would you give up the goalie and the forward in exchange for another forward who happens to also be a Jack Hughes? If you do this, you're putting the Vancouver Canucks in a position where all of a sudden Michael DiPietro is the projected next guy, quote unquote. You're riding on the last few years of Jacob Markstrom's career, giving DiPietro the extra time he needs to become an eventual NHL backup and eventual NHL starter. Maybe you sign a goalie in free agency to help you out on the backup side of things for the time being, or you try to let Michael DiPietro hold the reins himself at 21 years old. Either or, there are options here. You could debate that the timeline of Demko becoming too good too quickly does exist, which will force a Jacob Markstrom to eventually leave his job, which is why you consider this idea. As for Podkolzin, you would really just be swapping Podkolzin for Jack Hughes here, which opens up the possibility of changing the way your lineup looks. Instead of having Elias Pettersson as your first-line center, maybe have Jack Hughes as the first-line center and move Pettersson to the right wing. If you have that as your first-line power play setup with Besser on the right side, Miller down at the point, and Quinn Hughes on the other side, all of a sudden things look very, very interesting. That's no disrespect to Vasili Podkolzin, but Jack Hughes is a guy who was projected to becoming a franchise player for the past 2 years pretty much. I'll repeat myself from all the other videos I've made about Jack Hughes, but having one bad rookie season to me is not going to change the way that his future develops. I still think he's going to be incredibly amazing, and if the Vancouver Canucks are in a position to trade away Demko and Podkolzin for Jack Hughes, that's something that honestly I sit down and I think about for quite some time. Devil's advocate though, obviously, the argument to defend Demko and Podkolzin does exist too. Why would the Canucks want to acquire another skilled forward playmaker like they already have in their system already? Podkolzin adds an interesting and new dynamic that this team doesn't have, and that in itself is so much more valuable than what a Jack Hughes could potentially add, especially combined with the Thatcher Demko, who makes a Jacob Markstrom somewhat expendable down the line, or who provides a really good backup position for the Canucks if they're able to keep the Jacob Markstrom in net. If I'm going to be honest, I'm expecting this comment section to be even more heated than the one 2 years ago, because with the information we have now on Demko, Markstrom, Pettersson, and DiPietro, there are certainly more layers to peel back from, but at the same time, there are still the arguments on both sides that make so much sense. So I turn this to you in the comments like I did 2 years ago. Do you trade Demko and Podkolzin for Jack Hughes? Now, I'm sorry, New Jersey fans, since this is mostly a Vancouver Canucks related discussion that we had 2 years ago, I'm posing this question mostly to Vancouver Canucks fans. I'm not really too sure if Devils fans would be interested in parting ways with Jack Hughes in exchange for Demko and Podkolzin. You guys got Mackenzie Blackwood in there who's looking to become really good. But at the same time, there is a very interesting dynamic that Podkolzin could add to your team, so if you want to throw your thoughts out there, I'd certainly be willing to listen to those as well, but the discussion here mostly lies in Vancouver fans because this is a discussion that we had amongst Vancouver fans 2 years ago. Let's just remind you all of that. So would you do it? Demko and Podkolzin for Jack Hughes. It's something that, when presented 2 years ago, I said yes, I probably would do it inside of my head. But now, I'm not too sure. The arguments do exist on both sides, but I'm not too sure. So would you do it? Comment down what you think. I hope you enjoyed this video, so that and bye.